I'm the night DJ at WLVX, the only radio station in Millfield. It's a small town, the kind where everyone knows your name and your business. My job was pretty ordinary, playing music for late-night listeners until those calls started. It was around midnight on a Tuesday when I first heard that crackling voice. The line was full of static, like the caller was far away, or maybe not even on this planet. "Play Moonlight Serenade," the voice said, slow and deep. I didn't think much of it. Just another old-time music fan, I guessed. But then it happened again the next night, and the next. Always around midnight, always that same static-filled voice, requesting some old, almost forgotten song. I started to feel a chill down my spine whenever the phone rang at that hour. I mentioned it to a few friends, and that's when I heard about the disappearances. Apparently, Millfield had its share of people vanishing without a trace, going back decades. It was one of those things people didn't talk about much. It was too unsettling, especially in a town like ours. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started digging into the old records at the local library. What I found was more than unsettling. It was downright horrifying. Each song requested by my midnight caller had been a favorite of someone who disappeared in Millfield, on the very night of their disappearance. I couldn't just ignore it. I had to find out who was making these calls and why. But how? The calls were anonymous, untraceable. I felt like I was in over my head, drowning in a mystery too deep and dark for me. Then, one night, the caller changed their pattern. "Play Stardust," the voice crackled, sending shivers down my spine. But this time, they added something new. "Do you like the song, Anna?" My blood ran cold. They knew my name. This wasn't some random prank or a coincidence. This was personal. I hung up, my hands shaking. I wanted to quit, to walk away from WLVX and never look back. But I couldn't. I needed answers. The next day, I went to the town archives, determined to learn everything I could about the disappearances. Hours of poring over old newspapers and police reports painted a grim picture. People of all ages, vanishing without a trace. No pattern, no reason. And now, their favorite songs were being used to torment me. I was about to leave when an old article caught my eye. A story about a local musician who vanished 50 years ago. His name was Tom. He'd been a regular performer at Millfield's bars, known for his love of obscure old songs, the kind my caller always requested. A crazy idea formed in my head. What if Tom was the caller? But that was impossible. He'd be ancient by now if he was even still alive. Still, I couldn't shake the thought. That night, the call came right on schedule. "Play Dream a Little Dream of Me," the voice said. I took a deep breath. "Is this Tom?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a pause, a crackling silence that felt like an eternity. Then, "Yes." I didn't know whether to scream or cry. The voice continued, telling me a tale that was hard to believe, yet impossible to dismiss. Tom had been in love, he said, with a woman who disappeared. Heartbroken, he'd made a pact with something he didn't understand, something dark and ancient. In exchange for a chance to see his love again, Tom had been cursed to exist in a sort of limbo, neither alive nor dead. His only connection to the world he'd lost was through these songs, the favorites of those who, like his love, had vanished. "Why are you calling me?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You're the key, Sarah," Tom's voice crackled. "You can set me free, play the songs, and let me reach her." I was terrified, but also moved by Tom's tragic story. I agreed to help, not fully understanding what I was getting into. Night after night, I played the requested songs. And each night, Tom's voice grew clearer, more human. He started to remember more about his life, his love, his music. It was like I was bringing him back to life, one song at a time. Then came the night of the last song. "Play My Foolish Heart," Tom said, his voice almost normal now. "And thank you, Anna." I played the song, my heart pounding. As the last notes faded, I waited for Tom to speak. but there was only silence. He was gone. I thought it was over, but I was wrong. The next day, a woman walked into the station. She was old, her hair white as snow, but her eyes were bright and sharp. She introduced herself as Tom's lover, the one he'd lost all those years ago. She told me she'd heard the songs, each one a piece of her own past, calling to her. And on the last night, she'd heard Tom's voice, whispering her name in the music. It had brought her back to Millfield, back to the place where their love had been cut short. We talked for hours about Tom, the music, the mysteries of Millfield. And when she left, I felt a sense of closure for both of us. Story number 2. I'm Han, just your average guy. Never believed much in the supernatural. That was until I started working the night shift at a remote gas station. It's a lonely job, just me and the hum of the refrigerators. The kind of place where you start talking to yourself just to break the silence. You know, I always thought those horror stories about working the graveyard shift were just that. Stories. Boy, was I wrong. The first few weeks were uneventful, just the occasional trucker or lost traveler. But then, things started getting weird, real weird. It began with small things. I'd place a candy bar on the shelf, turn around, and find it on the floor. Clumsy me, I'd think. But then it happened more often, objects moving, and the whispers. I'd hear them when the station was empty, soft, unintelligible whispers that seemed to come from the aisles. I tried to brush it off as fatigue or maybe the wind, but then came the cold spots. One minute the air would be warm, the next it was like stepping into a freezer. That's not normal, right? I started feeling uneasy, like I wasn't alone. I told myself I was just being paranoid. But that night changed everything. It was past midnight, the kind of quiet where even the crickets seemed to sleep. Then a car pulled up. Nothing unusual about that, but I felt a chill run down my spine. The driver stepped out, a regular-looking guy, Asian, like me. He walked in, browsed around, picked up some snacks. Normal stuff. But when he came to the counter, his face, it twisted into something horrific, like a mask of pain and anger, all contorted. It scared the hell out of me. He reached over the counter and grabbed me. His hands were cold, unnaturally so, and strong like iron. I struggled, managed to break free, and bolted into the back room. Locked the door, and just sat there, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what just happened. I must have stayed there for hours, too scared to move. When dawn broke, I finally mustered the courage to come out. The station was empty, no sign of the man. I checked the security footage, hands shaking. But the tape, it showed nothing. The man never appeared on it. It was like he was never there. I tried to convince myself it was just a bad dream, but I couldn't. The memory was too vivid, too real. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't quit my job. I needed the money. But every night the fear was there. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Objects moved more frequently, and the cold spots, they seemed to follow me around the store. I started researching, looking for answers. I found stories of spirits and entities, but nothing that quite fit. The more I read, the more I felt lost. I was dealing with something unknown, something that didn't follow the rules of ghost stories or horror movies. Nights turned into weeks. I was tired, always looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows. Friends said I looked like a mess. But how could I explain? They wouldn't believe me. Who would? Then another encounter. Another late-night visitor. Different face. Same twisted expression. This time, I was ready. I grabbed my phone to record, to prove I wasn't losing my mind. But just like before, when I looked at the footage, there was nothing. Just me, talking to thin air. I was at my wit's end. I considered seeing a psychiatrist, but deep down, I knew this wasn't in my head. It was real. Too real. One night, I decided to confront it. I stayed in the store, waiting. The whispers grew louder. The temperature dropped. Then, the silence. Deafening, Absolute silence. I felt a presence, something watching me. I spoke into the darkness, demanding answers. At first, nothing. Then, a voice. Not the whispers, but a clear, distinct voice. It told me about the land, the history, the pain and suffering that had occurred right where the gas station now stood. It spoke of unresolved anguish, of spirits tied to the place, unable to move on. I listened, heart racing, as the voice recounted tragedies long forgotten, buried in the haste to develop and modernize. It wasn't malevolent. It was sad, desperate even. It wanted to be heard, to be acknowledged. I did the only thing I could think of. I promised to remember, to tell the stories. And as I did, the temperature began to rise, the whispers faded. A sense of peace settled over the station. The next day I started researching the history of the land. I talked to local historians, dug through old records. I learned about battles, about people who had lived and died here, their stories lost to time. I kept my promise. I set up a small memorial in the gas station, telling the stories of the land and the people who had once called it home. It felt right, respectful. The strange occurrences stopped. The whispers, the cold spots, the moving objects. Gone. The nights were quiet again, peaceful even. Story number 3. I've always thought of myself as a rational person. You have to be when you're an ER nurse like me, Sarah. Every shift is a whirlwind of blood, tears, and life or death decisions. But that night, that eerie night in room 7, rationality slipped through my fingers like sand. It was a normal late shift at first. The usual cacophony of beeping machines and urgent voices filled the air. I was checking on Mr. Hendricks, an elderly man with a heart condition, in room 6 when I heard it. A faint murmur from next door, room 7. Room 7 was infamous among the staff. It was an ordinary room, but patients assigned there often spoke of a shadowy figure. They said it whispered secrets in the dead of night. I never believed it. After all, hospitals are places of science, not superstition. But curiosity got the better of me. I peeked into room 7 where a new patient, a young guy named Marcus, was muttering to himself. "He's here," Marcus whispered, staring into an empty corner. "The Shadow Man." My heart pounded against my chest, but I brushed it off as nerves. "Marcus, there's no one there," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. As I stepped closer, the air in the room felt colder, heavier. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A dark, shadowy figure, its outline blurred like smoke. It turned towards me, and 2 glowing red eyes met mine. A surge of cold fear gripped me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The figure lunged, passing through me with a bone-chilling coldness that made my soul shiver. I stumbled back, gasping for air. The room was silent, except for the steady beep of Marcus's heart monitor. He lay motionless, his eyes closed. I checked his pulse. He was alive, but in a deep coma. How? Why? The rest of the night was a blur. I reported what happened to Dr. Reynolds, but my words sounded like the ramblings of a madwoman. A shadow figure? Red eyes? Dr. Reynolds frowned, clearly not believing a word. "Sarah, you need some rest." But I couldn't rest. Not with the image of those glowing red eyes seared into my mind. I started researching, digging into hospital records, desperate for answers. That's when I found it. A pattern. Every patient who had seen the shadow in room 7 ended up in a coma. No explanation, no warning. Just like Marcus. Days turned into weeks. Marcus's condition didn't change. The hospital board decided to close room 7, but that didn't stop the nightmares. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadow with its red eyes, heard its whispering voice. I knew I had to face it, to find out what it wanted. One night, I snuck into the abandoned room 7. The air was stale, the silence suffocating. "Show yourself," I whispered into the darkness. Nothing. "Please," I begged, my voice trembling. What do you want? Then a low, guttural voice filled the room. Freedom, it hissed. My blood turned cold. Freedom from what? The curse, the voice replied, echoing around me. I am bound to this place, a prisoner of my own making. Free me, and I will leave. How? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Replace me, it said, and a chill ran down my spine. No, I said, backing away. I can't. The shadow laughed, a sound that made my skin crawl. Then more will suffer. I left room 7 feeling more lost than ever. I couldn't condemn myself to an eternity as a shadow, but I couldn't let others fall victim to this curse either. I decided to talk to Marcus's family. Maybe they knew something, anything, that could help. His sister, Emily, met me in the hospital cafe. Marcus always believed in the supernatural, Emily told me, her eyes distant. He said he felt a presence in that room. He thought it was trying to communicate. But why him? Why any of them? I asked. Emily shrugged. Maybe it's not about them. Maybe it's about the room. Her words struck a chord. I raced back to the hospital records, digging deeper this time. And then I found it, a forgotten piece of history. Room 7 was built over an old section of the hospital that burned down decades ago. One victim, a patient trapped in the fire, was never identified. A plan started to form in my mind. It was crazy, but it was all I had. I needed to free the shadow, to give it closure. That night, I returned to room 7 with an old hospital map and a printout of the fire report. I know who you are, I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. You were a patient here, lost in the fire. But you're not forgotten. The shadow appeared, its red eyes fixed on me. You know my pain? Yes, I said. And I'm here to help you find peace. I read aloud the names of the victims, ending with an unknown patient. You are remembered, I said. You can move on. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the shadow began to fade, its form dissolving into the air. The red eyes were the last to go, blinking out like dying embers. I exhaled, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief.